Pete the Wargamer here, back with another painting tutorial. This time we'll be tackling Aragorn from the Lord of the Rings Journeys in Middle-earth board game, and I'll be painting him using the Army Painter range of paints. Inside Journeys in Middle-earth, you'll find your miniatures pre-assembled and almost ready for painting, but before we break out the paintbrushes, we first need to do a little prep, but feel free to skip to the timestamp on screen now to go directly to the painting. First of all, your miniatures may have some mould lines, basically thin seams that run across the model surface that were created by the moulding process. These lines become much more apparent once painted, so it's best to remove them. I personally like to use a sharp blade, a scalpel in my case, to scrape away these lines and other imperfections on the model. However, a small file can be used to the same effect if you prefer. Now that our model is cleaned of mould lines, we need to ensure that there are no chemicals left on the model from the casting process, as these can interfere with your paint and prevent it from sticking to the surface. These can be easily removed though by placing your models into a bowl of hot soapy water and leaving them to soak for around 5 to 10 minutes. Then, being careful not to burn yourself, remove the model from the water and lightly scrub with a toothbrush, ensuring you get into those deep recesses, as this is where the release agents are most likely to remain. Once scrubbed, rinse with cold water and leave to dry. You can also use some hot water to adjust your models should they become misshapen. Simply leave the affected area in some hot water until it becomes soft and pliable. Then, carefully bend the piece back to its correct position and hold it in place until the model cools. So with the model cleaned and readjusted, we can begin painting it. Priming is an important first step in the miniature painting process, as it will ensure that the later layers of paint adhere to the miniature's surface properly. I'm using my airbrush here to apply my primer, but you could instead use a brush-on primer or a spray can based primer instead. It's really down to personal preference and what you have available. You can see that I'm using a grey primer here. This is a fairly neutral colour that means the various greens, browns and other mid-tones that this miniature will feature can be applied much more easily, but again, the choice of colour is entirely your own. And so we can finally begin our painting. We'll be tackling the base coat of the model first, and with these I like to thin down the paint a little, using some water to make the application easier and the finish smoother. Mix in water with your paint until you have a consistency similar to what you see here. Once your paint has been sufficiently thinned, you can then apply it to your model. Apply at least 2 thin coats of paint to ensure a good, even coverage, allowing the paint to dry thoroughly between applications. The first paint that I'm using here is Alf Green, and this is being applied to Aragorn's tabard. This earthy colour is the theme that we'll be following across the whole of this miniature, to better represent the ranger's life in the wild. For the trousers, or pants for my American viewers, we want to paint on some leather brown, in the same way as we painted the tabard. You'll notice that I'm painting the deeper parts of the model first. This method will reduce the chances of spilling it over onto other areas when you're trying to fit your brush into the smaller, more awkward to reach places. For the various areas of leather across the model, which include the belt, braces, boots and scabbard, I have opted for the darker oak brown. Using a deeper brown such as this will help to add some variation to the various browns on the model. To tackle the trim on the tabard, a coat of the slightly washed out colour of Werewolf Fur will do nicely. To paint Aragorn's cape, I have opted to use some field grey. I've taken inspiration from the elven cloaks of the Lord of the Rings films here, and I've chosen a paint which better represents the slightly greenish grey of the cloaks. The face and the hands are the next areas to paint, and these will be tackled with some Kobold Skin. We're starting with a lighter paint here, and our later washes will help to darken down this colour somewhat, creating some starker contrast in the process. To give Aragorn's hair a very dark brown colour, I'll be starting off with the almost black grey of Necromancer Cloak. Take care not to spill onto his face with this step, especially when painting around the beard. For the metal of Aragorn's blades and buckles, we want to apply a base coat of gunmetal. Take particular care with this step, as metallic paints can be a little tricky to cover up if you do overspill, so take your time and use a slightly smaller brush if necessary. Once you've completed this step, be sure to clean out your brushes and water pots thoroughly to avoid any cross-contamination of metal flakes to your other paints. Our next few steps will involve applying washes to our miniature, but before you do so, we first want to thin it down in order to reduce its intensity. I'm going to mix in a little Quickshade mixing medium to my wash in roughly equal parts wash to medium. You could instead use water, but medium will create a smoother looking transition between the darker and lighter areas. The first wash to use here is Strong Tone, and once it's been thinned out, you can apply it over the entirety of Aragorn's clothes, leaving his face, hair, cloak and weaponry alone for now. The wash will have two effects. First, it will flow into the recessed areas, helping to create shading and adding depth. Secondly, the brown colour of the wash will also create the appearance of dirt and grime over the cloth, once again leading to that grubby, weather-beaten appearance of the Ranger. Once your first layer has dried, if you feel like your shading isn't dark enough, feel free to directly target more of the wash into those recesses. This can be used to really boost the contrast and bring out that detail. Following the same steps as before, apply a thin layer of flesh wash over Aragorn's face and hands. Like before, allow your first layer to dry and use some targeting washes to enhance some of the more prominent facial features. To finish off the washes, we'll then be applying a wash of dark tone over the remaining areas, namely the cloak, hair and metal areas. This darker wash will help to boost the shading much more than the previous ones did, which will prove particularly helpful with Aragorn's dark hair. Once your washes have been allowed to dry thoroughly, your miniature is at a perfectly serviceable gaming standard and can easily be left as it is. However, if you're wanting to take your model to the next level, let's add some highlights. We'll be starting off using some army green to pick out the raised edges of the green cloth of the tabard. To do this, take a brush with a fine point and dip it into some slightly watered down paint. Then gently drag the brush along the raised edges, creating a thin line of lighter coloured paint. Focus more heavily on the upper edges. I try to imagine a bright light above the model and focus on the areas where the light would appear to be the brightest and avoid the parts that would be in shadow. I find this gives a much more realistic looking result. For the trousers, I'll be adding some monster brown to the areas of fabric covering the knees. This not only adds some definition, but will also give them a worn look as well. Next, we want to give the leather areas that we painted with oak brown a slightly reddish hue. This can easily be created with a highlight of fur brown. If you're feeling extra creative here, you can also apply some short, thin lines perpendicular to the edges of the straps. Once completed, this will help to create the illusion of aged and cracked leather. To bring out the details in the brown trim of the tabard, we'll be using some castle grey. This slightly washed out grey brown can be used in a similar way to the weathering we did in the last step to give the cloth a frayed appearance. Another good area to apply this weathering technique is to the cloak, which we'll be highlighting with some of the aptly named Filthy Cape. For the facial features and fingers, we want to apply some thin lines of corpse pale along the more prominent features such as the bridge of the nose, cheekbones, forehead and knuckles. As an optional step, you can also tackle Aragorn's eyes here, but only do so if you have a steady hand and a fine brush. First, black out the eye with some Necromancer Cloak, then using some Spaceship Exterior, apply a thin white line, leaving a little black still visible around the edge of the eye. Then, using some Oak Brown, apply a small dot to the centre of the eye for the iris. To complete Aragorn's dark brown hair, I'll be using some Oak Brown as a highlight to pick out some of the individual hairs. Highlighting over the Necromancer Cloak base coat in this way will give us a very dark brown finish. The final step in highlighting Aragorn is to pick out the edges of the silver areas with some plate mail metal. By focusing along the edges of the blades, we'll create the appearance of a sharper edge. So at this stage your miniature has been fully painted, but there are still a few extra steps we can take to make the base a little more interesting. However, if you want to skip this step and see the finished miniature, simply skip ahead to the timestamp on screen now. One of the easiest methods for basing that I've found is to use a textured paint. I personally make good use of Vallejos Dark Earth texture. The paint is much thicker than normal paint and contains a fine grit. Use an older brush to paint this onto the base of your model. Applying the paint quite liberally will allow you to add bumps and dips to your base, giving it an uneven and more realistic appearance. However, take care not to overspill onto your model's feet or around the edge of the base. If you do, don't worry, it's not the end of the world. Simply use a damp brush or a finger to quickly wipe it away. Once the textured paint has been applied over the entire base and allowed to dry, add a wash of strong tone over the top, similar to the way that we applied our earlier washes. Once the wash is dried, take an older and larger brush, dip it into some monster brown, and then wipe the brush across some tissue or paper so that only a little paint remains spread across the bristles. With this brush, lightly drag the bristles across your base. You'll find that the paint only accumulates on the more raised edges, creating an instant and extremely quick highlight. Much like our earlier highlights, this dry brushing technique will go some way to improving the realism of the model. For the lip of the base, the colour choice really is yours. Some like to colour code their models to make them easy to identify at a quick glance, but I prefer a more subdued leather brown applied in the same way as our previous base coats. With the base texture completed, we need to protect our paintwork, especially if you intend to use your models for gaming purposes. And matte varnish is perfect for this, as it will not only stop your paint from rubbing away, but also remove any glossiness caused by the washes. How you apply the varnish is up to you. Much like the primer, I'm applying it through an airbrush, but you can also brush it on with a regular brush or use some from a spray can. Once again, the choice is down to your personal circumstances. After giving the varnish at least an hour or so to dry, we can add a little foliage to the base. The quickest and easiest way to do this is with some grass tufts. These can be purchased in a wide range of styles and sizes to represent whatever battlefield you're looking to create. Regardless of the type you choose, they can be applied in the same way. Use some tweezers to pick up the tuft and choose your location. Then, with the suitable area chosen, apply a small dot of superglue to the base. Then, firmly place the tuft onto the glue and hold it in place for a few seconds until the glue has dried. Repeat this process as many times as you need. Using a mix of tufts can create some interesting results. And here we have the completed Aragorn, ready for your games of Journeys in Middle-earth. You can find a full list of all the paints and materials used in this tutorial in the description below, along with any other equipment that I've used to create this video. If you have any questions or would just like to chat with others who enjoy my channel, I've set up a Discord server which you can find a link to in the description below. If you enjoy my tutorials and would like to support me in making more, you should check out my Patreon page. From there you can donate to me from as little as $1 a month, which just helps me in producing this content. And so the only thing left to say is, thanks for watching and goodbye.